It does kind of feel like a chapter has closed for the video games industry. You see, going from one console generation to the next used to be a massive deal, and it still is to some degree. But if you were around for when, say, the PS1 went to the PS2, or even from the PS2 generation to the era of the PS3 and Xbox 360, the NES to the SNES to the N64, N64 to the GameCube or the PS1, etc., etc. Those were massive, monolithic steps up in terms of the graphical fidelity that blew your mind at the time as to what video games were capable of and what you were capable of seeing and then playing. I remember one Christmas morning when I got my PS2 and booting up the Spyro the Dragon Tales for the very first time. And yeah, a lot of people didn't like that game, but I was a kid and the game at the time blew my mind as to how beautiful games were. Going from what Spyro was in the PS1 to how it looked in the PS2, and all that it encompassed was a mind-blowing experience. It was a massive step up in terms of the visuals of the game, and just what the medium was capable of at that time. And ever so recently, and I think it became extremely apparent to a lot of people going from, say, the Xbox One/PS4 era to the Xbox Series X and the PS5 to this era, the graphical step up was there, don't get me wrong, but it's not as significant as it used to be. And I think people en masse are starting to come to this realization that the time of those massive steps up in terms of graphical performance and just how beautiful games can look has almost passed us by and is in the rearview mirror now. Not fully, but I don't know if I'll ever have that singular collective wow moment like we did all those years ago. Or if we do, it'll be for slightly different reasons and for different contexts. And it's for those different contexts that I wanted to make today's video. Because I think it's easy to say that sure, games can get more beautiful, we can pump out more resolution if we really need to, and stuff like that. We can fine-tune some artistic design and visions and lighting dynamics here and there and here, whither and thither and all that. And while we may never have a PS1 to PS2 era leap like we did in the past, what I think we can have is more of a broad spectrum wow feeling. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, we are starting to see the rise of 1440p, 2K, 4K gaming, and the prevalence that has become and is becoming. I don't really see the industry wildly advancing past that. Like, I can't imagine 8K gaming, when it eventually becomes a thing, will be all that significant. I think what we are going to continue to see, and what we have already started to see, is gaming companies go down one or both paths here. One path is expanding on what is already there and taking the current graphical fidelity, maybe tuning it a little bit, but expanding it, having games be bigger or more dense than ever before, filled with more things to do, possible calculations that can be performed simultaneously with more powerful hardware and processing power, etc., etc. What was one of the biggest things they utilized, or at least Sony utilized, to advertise the PS5? Do you remember Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart? Yeah, it didn't make all that much money for Sony, but it did show off crowd density, and it showed off the load times of the game. And the game was beautiful to boot, don't get me wrong, but it seemed like a majority of the emphasis in the marketing didn't necessarily go into how beautiful the game looked, but more so in terms of how fast the game could load, new locations and all that, but also how dense and how many things could be on the screen processed at a singular moment in time. While we may never get another PS1 to PS2 era update or upgrade, and I know that's not the biggest one ever to happen, but it's the most meaningful one that I personally experienced and lived through, so it'll be my primary example. Leave a comment down below with your favorite example of when you had that wow moment, when you went from one generation to the next and were completely blown away. I'd love to hear your stories and your experiences. But I feel like instead of having a game technically look more beautiful, because it has more polygons and all that, we're going to see games with more things to do on the screen, more NPCs, and just bigger, better experiences. And I feel like we'll have that growing pain like we usually do, where the focus goes more in terms of that wow factor instead of creating a coherent experience, and it'll be reined into whatever degree is needed. But the capabilities of having all of these new NPCs or all this new density and being able to run all these formulas and processes at the same time or within a quicker span of time than ever before will open the doors to different styles of games and different methodologies and techniques that can be incorporated into a game. I think we'll also start to see the massive explosion of higher FPS gaming. AI is a force multiplier at this point. It is inevitable and it is coming. And while the discussion has been focused primarily on things like AI art and all that, which is wildly controversial, and understandably so, when it comes to frame generation and the technologies that Nvidia and AMD are starting to pump out in regards to stuff like FSR3 or DLSS and frame gen from Nvidia, it's honestly quite impressive how you can take a game on hardware, tack on this new formula, and all of a sudden you just get essentially a whole bunch of new FPS for essentially free. And while yes, there is technically some growing pains to be had there, this is an ever-evolving medium, an ever-evolving technology that will get fine-tuned and honed accordingly over time. Does anyone out there realistically think this technology won't get better within even say like a year or so? Come on. When you put a bunch of sweaty nerds in a room and tell them, get me more FPS, generally you get more FPS when they come out of that freaking room. And for a games industry that has struggled for so long to get out of this 30 FPS doldrum that has plagued the console market for years at this point, we're starting to see more and more games embrace 60 FPS and even 120 FPS gaming. Not necessarily as an advertisable feature, but as the norm. And I imagine in the future, and even when we get to the next generation from Sony and Xbox, we'll see that continue. Especially if consoles start to incorporate this frame gen technology, or whatever AMD's equivalent is. I made a video just yesterday about the Switch 2, and how I want to see not necessarily the graphical enhancements that the console can bring to the table, but more so the frame rate that first-party titles could incorporate and utilize. That to me is far more important because frame rate is an objective fact. It augments the playing experience, not just the visual fidelity or the visual style of the game. It affects the actual gameplay and your button inputs. And it makes a game fundamentally just run better on the whole, unless it's an egregious outlier example. So I imagine we're going to see two main trends in the video games industry, with a possible third one re-emerging. And I'll get into why I think re-emerging in a second. But the two main trends are, we'll start to see more things happening on a screen or in a rendered scene at any given moment in time. We'll start to see games become bigger and better with even bigger open worlds, a la stuff like GTA 6. And we'll start to see frame rates absolutely explode. Not necessarily because of better hardware, but because of the technologies that these companies are starting to output and incorporate into these games to just generate more frames through other methods like AI generation and stuff like that. There's a lot of potential there that we are only scratching the surface of. And when you get into the weeds and you start to find out about some of these techniques and some of this new technology that is coming out that game developers can start to utilize, it's absolutely mind-blowing. So while we may never get a graphical wow moment in the same way that we had with the PS1 going to the PS2 or whatnot, I think we'll get those kinds of wow moments just in different ways. Now, obviously, virtual reality, that's the third one I was alluding to this entire time, by the way. We need to talk about it. Yes, look, we all want Sword Art Online at some point. Tech's not there yet, but let's be fair here. Does anyone think it won't get there at some point? No one thought that a lot of this technology would come to fruition, or at least be in this state, even now. Technology is advancing at a faster rate than we can possibly fathom. I forget where the hell that quote originated from. If you do, leave it in the comments down below. And it's absolutely mind-boggling the stuff we have access to now, and that is starting to become incorporated into the video game medium. And it's damn near impossible to imagine what we'll have tomorrow, or next year, or 5 years from now, or whatever. There's a lot of potential there, for both good and bad, but potential nonetheless. And I tend to be an optimist when it comes to stuff like this, and I'm just thinking about what that moment's going to be like when virtual reality is really fine-tuned, the price gets cut down a lot, becomes far more accessible, immersive, and engaging and fun. Like, there's tech in some of these VR headsets to where If you have a fear of flying, you can just throw on a movie on the projector screen in the virtual reality world that you're in, and just watch a movie and take yourself out of that fear, for at least a little part of time. At least that's the idea. That's a really cool concept. Or stuff like being able to have a virtual reality experience as if you're at a concert or at a sports game or whatever. Maybe you weren't able to make it, but you can still have some version of that experience. Still within the comfort of your own home, apartment, or wherever you currently are. And that's not even for games. Like, we're starting to see RPGs being made for virtual reality, and for them to start really succeeding, and to show the potential that has. And we're still in, like, the infant stage of this technology, of this incorporation, of these techniques and ideas that developers will hone over time, with technology that will only get better. It's kind of wild to think about it, about all the cool games and experiences and even possible genres that may emerge because of this tech. Because none of this stuff is developed in a vacuum. The processing power that we're starting to see come out, alongside these new techniques in game development, as well as frame generation and better performance for games on the whole, even out of weaker hardware, on top of games at least having the capabilities to include even more stuff within them, all of this stuff will work with each other eventually. And someone out there, eventually down the line, will put all these pieces of the puzzle together. And there'll come a day when we have our minds collectively blown about the potential that video games still have on offer. And we'll get our wow moment all over again. It's really easy to become blinded in terms of the progression and progress we have made so far, and where we currently are at. And it can be hard to borderline impossible to imagine what the future holds. And we can get stuck in a rut and believe that we have now reached the peak and that there's no going up but only viewing the horizons from here. And then all of a sudden we realize we are not even halfway up the mountain. It is wild to think about. It is crazy to think about even. And I think there are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic about the state of video games and video game development especially. Plenty of reasons, let's be fair here. But I also think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about gaming's future, and the potential of the medium to tell different stories, to tell different experiences, and all this. Like how all those years ago, it was hard to imagine how anything would surpass those few initial moments when we had our minds blown with a new console generation or a new game that blew our minds as to the potential of video game graphics and how beautiful games could look or play. We always find ourselves at a crossroads, or at a moment in time where our preconceptions are blown apart all over again. I think the current state of, virtual reality as well is not the best of spots. It's wildly expensive, and most of the games on offer just, at least to me, aren't all that appealing. And if this is where virtual reality always would be, then yeah, probably wouldn't be for me. But again, nothing lasts forever, and video games are always changing. Someone somewhere out there is always thinking about, yeah, but what if we do this? What if we push this boundary, etc., etc. Nothing's ever stagnant. And when you think it is when it all changes on a dime, at a moment's notice. There's a lot of work to be done, nothing's perfect, and there's a lot of issues in the video game medium that deserve to be called out, critiqued, analyzed, and talked about, and discussed. Absolutely, and that will always be the case. And you know I'll do it on this channel. But I think every now and then, it's important to just take into perspective how far we have come, and to imagine, for even a second, how far we can go. Because maybe the direction is slightly different, but we still have a long way to go. And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day. Hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload and stream in the future, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.